Imagine a world where the sun rises not over the quiet ripples of the Persian Gulf, but over a landscape transformed by a blinding, artificial light. A world where the unthinkable has finally happened. For decades, the prospect of a nuclear strike has been relegated to the pages of Cold War thrillers and dystopian cinema. But what if the order was actually given? What if the United States, the only nation to ever use a nuclear weapon in combat, decided to break the 80-year nuclear taboo against Iran? To understand why this hasn't happened, and why it likely never will, we must look past the explosive power of the bombs themselves and into the brutal, cold machinery of global geopolitics. The tension between Washington and Tehran is not a new story. It is a decades-long chess match played with high-stakes sanctions, proxy wars, and maritime skirmishes. From the 1979 revolution to the modern-day complexities of the Strait of Hormuz, the friction is constant. In this environment, the question often arises from those frustrated by the slow grind of conventional conflict. Why not just end it? Why does a superpower like the US engage in forever wars and costly occupations when it possesses the ultimate delete key in its arsenal? To the casual observer, it might seem like a shortcut to peace. In reality, dropping a nuclear bomb on Iran would not be the end of a war. It would be the beginning of a global collapse that no nation, including the United States, is prepared to survive. To analyze why the US hasn't and won't take this step, we must first look at the sheer scale of the devastation such a choice would bring, starting with the most immediate consequence: the death of the quick victory myth. History has shown us that nuclear weapons are not surgical tools. They are blunt instruments of total annihilation. If the US were to strike Iranian nuclear facilities or command centers with tactical nuclear warheads, the immediate death toll would be staggering. But the strategic fallout would be even worse. Instead of a surrender, the US would face a long war of a different kind, a total existential insurgency. The first major damage of such a strike is the guaranteed prolongation of the conflict. In a conventional war, there is room for negotiation, for off-ramps, and for diplomatic retreats. The moment a nuclear weapon is used, the Iranian government, its military, and its vast network of regional proxies, from Hezbollah in Lebanon to the Houthis in Yemen, no longer have any reason to hold back. This isn't just a war for territory anymore. It becomes a war for the survival of a civilization. The quick end promised by the bomb turns into a 1,000-year grudge. The Middle East would ignite in a way that makes the Iraq and Afghanistan wars look like minor border disputes. Every American interest, every embassy, and every soldier stationed in the region would become a target for a scorched earth retaliation that would last for generations. Beyond the immediate human tragedy, we have to consider the physical reality of the battlefield. Iran is not a flat desert. It is a fortress of rugged mountains and deep-seated underground facilities. A nuclear strike might destroy a city, but it cannot easily eliminate an entire military infrastructure buried hundreds of meters beneath the Zagros Mountains. Consequently, the US would still be forced to send in ground troops to confirm the destruction and occupy the territory. Except now, those soldiers would be marching into a radioactive wasteland. The cost of maintaining an army in a contaminated environment is astronomical. It requires specialized equipment, constant medical monitoring, and a logistical chain that is constantly under threat from dirty insurgent tactics. Furthermore, we must address the risk to the fleet. The U.S. Navy's presence in the Persian Gulf is its primary tool for projecting power. However, a nuclear escalation would turn the narrow waters of the Gulf into a death trap. Iran's anti-access/area denial A2/AD capabilities are designed for exactly this, making the cost of entry too high for the U.S. Navy. In a post-nuclear scenario, Iran would likely deploy its entire arsenal of swarm boats, sea mines, and anti-ship missiles. Even a victorious U.S. might find itself losing a multi-billion-dollar aircraft carrier to a desperate retaliatory strike. The loss of a single carrier would be a psychological and military blow that the American public is not prepared to handle. Then, there is the crushing economic reality. The cost of war is often measured in dollars, but in this hypothetical, it is measured in the collapse of the global energy market. Iran sits at the throat of the world's oil supply. A nuclear strike would instantly shut down the Strait of Hormuz. The resulting spike in oil prices wouldn't just affect the U.S. It would paralyze the economies of Europe, China, and India. The world would blame the United States for the ensuing global depression. The financial cost of cleaning up a nuclear site, providing humanitarian aid to millions of refugees, and the loss of global trade would dwarf the entire USS national debt. But perhaps the most terrifying damage is the spread of war. We do not live in a unipolar world anymore. A nuclear strike on Iran would be viewed by Russia and China not as a localized conflict, but as a direct threat to the international order. It would signal that the rules of the game have changed. If the U.S. uses nuclear weapons to solve a regional dispute, what stops Russia from doing the same in Eastern Europe? What stops other nations from racing to acquire their own deterrents as fast as possible? The nuclear taboo is the only thing keeping the world from a state of permanent, hair-trigger tension. Once that seal is broken, the risk of a global thermonuclear exchange, World War III, becomes a daily reality rather than a distant fear. While the strategic fallout of a nuclear strike is cataclysmic, we must look deeper into the physical and tactical reasons why such an option remains a last resort. Many people assume that a nuclear weapon is a magic wand that simply erases an enemy's ability to fight. In the case of Iran, this is a dangerous misunderstanding of both nuclear physics and Persian geography. Iran is not a small, flat island. It is a massive, mountainous fortress nearly 3 times the size of France. Its military infrastructure is not sitting in plain sight. It is woven into the very crust of the earth. To understand why the U.S. doesn't use these weapons to end the war early, we have to look at the hardened target problem. Over the last 30 years, Iran has watched the U.S. military operate in Iraq and Serbia. They learned that air superiority is the American way of war. In response, they built what is known as passive defense. This includes thousands of kilometers of tunnels, underground missile cities, and command centers buried deep under granite mountains. Even a tactical nuclear strike, designed to penetrate the ground, has limits. To guarantee the destruction of a facility like Fordow, which is buried deep inside a mountain, the U.S. would need to use a high-yield weapon. Doing so would create a massive cloud of radioactive fallout that would drift across international borders, potentially hitting U.S. allies in the Gulf, or even reaching as far as Afghanistan and Pakistan. This brings us to the second major damage, the risk of losing the fleet and the A2/AD bubble. If the U.S. initiated a nuclear strike, the Iranian response would not be a traditional army-to-army battle. It would be an asymmetric nightmare. Iran's military doctrine is built around anti-access/area denial. They don't need to defeat the U.S. Navy in a fair fight. They only need to make the Persian Gulf unusable. In the minutes following a nuclear detonation, Iran would likely launch every drone, cruise missile, and fast attack boat in its possession. They have developed swarm tactics specifically designed to overwhelm the Aegis combat systems of American destroyers. Imagine hundreds of small, explosive-laden boats charging a billion-dollar warship simultaneously. Even if the US kills 90% of them, the remaining 10% can cripple a carrier or sink a cruiser. In a post-nuclear environment, the rules of engagement vanish. Iran would have no reason not to use chemical or biological warheads on their remaining missiles, targeting US bases in Qatar, Bahrain, and the UAE. The early end to the war would instead turn into a desperate naval struggle to keep the world's most important waterway open while radioactive debris falls from the sky. The third damage is the sheer economic suicide of such a move. The US economy relies on global stability. A nuclear strike on a major oil-producing nation would cause the price of Brent crude to skyrocket to levels never seen in human history. Some analysts predict over $300 per barrel. This isn't just about expensive gas at the pump. It's about the collapse of the global supply chain. Every product moved by ship, truck, or plane would become prohibitively expensive. Inflation would turn into hyperinflation. By trying to save money by ending a war quickly with a bomb, the US would likely trigger a Great Depression that would last decades. The cost of the war would shift from military spending to the total collapse of the American middle class's purchasing power. Now, let's look at the comparison factor. Why did the US spend 20 years in Afghanistan or billions in Iraq without using these weapons? The answer lies in the utility of force. In a conventional war, you can win hearts and minds, you can rebuild infrastructure, and you can eventually leave behind a functioning state. A nuclear strike creates a failed state on a scale that cannot be fixed. If you destroy Iran's government and its environment, you are left with 85 million people who have no food, no water, and no hope. This creates a refugee crisis that would destabilize all of Europe and the Middle East. The US would be forced to pay for the cleanup for the next century. When you compare the cost of a long conventional war to the cost of the aftermath of a nuclear one, the conventional war is actually the cheaper and faster option. Furthermore, we must consider the inverse perspective. What if the US doesn't strike, but Iran believes they might? This is the essence of deterrence. The US keeps the nuclear option on the table not to use it, but to ensure Iran doesn't cross certain red lines, such as closing the Strait of Hormuz or attacking American soil directly. The moment the bomb is actually dropped, that threat is gone. You have used your ultimate card, and the enemy now has nothing left to lose. An enemy with nothing to lose is the most dangerous force on the planet. The spread of war is the final, and perhaps most terrifying, consequence in this segment. If the US uses a nuclear weapon against a non-nuclear state like Iran, the Global Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, dies instantly. Every country on Earth, from Saudi Arabia to Japan to South Korea, would realize that the only way to be safe from a superpower is to have their own nuclear weapons. We would enter an era of nuclear anarchy, where dozens of nations scramble to build bombs. The world would become a tinderbox where any small border dispute could lead to a mushroom cloud. The US would lose its status as a global leader and instead be seen as a rogue superpower, isolated and hated by former allies. So when we ask, why not just drop the bomb? We aren't just talking about military strategy. We are talking about the survival of the modern world as we know it. The US has the power to destroy Iran in an afternoon, but they don't have the power to survive the world that would exist the day after. If the first hour of a nuclear strike is defined by the blinding flash and the immediate physical destruction, the second hour belongs to the ghost army. To understand why the US avoids this path, we must look at Iran's unique military structure. Unlike a traditional Western military, which relies on centralized command and expensive hardware, Iran has spent 40 years building a decentralized axis of resistance. This is a network of battle-hardened proxies stretching from the Mediterranean Sea to the borders of Afghanistan. The moment a nuclear weapon is detected, the central command in Tehran, even if crippled, no longer needs to give orders. Preset dead-hand protocols would likely go into effect. This is where the myth of a contained war dies. The US wouldn't just be fighting the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. It would be fighting a multi-front war involving Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, and the Houthis in Yemen. The first retaliation would likely hit America's closest allies. Hezbollah possesses an estimated 150,000 rockets and precision-guided missiles aimed directly at Israel's heartland. In a post-nuclear scenario, there is no proportionality. Hezbollah would likely launch a saturation attack designed to overwhelm the Iron Dome. Simultaneously, Iraqi militias would turn their mortars and drones toward every remaining U.S. diplomatic and military outpost in Baghdad and Erbil. The U.S. would find its personnel trapped in green zones that have become kill boxes. But the most critical damage would be to the global energy arteries. We've mentioned the Strait of Hormuz, but the tactical reality is terrifying. Iran doesn't need to sink every ship. They only need to sink one VLCC, very large crude carrier, in the narrowest part of the shipping lane. A sunken supertanker, combined with a dirty sea of naval mines, would physically block the passage of 20% of the world's petroleum. The U.S. Navy would then be forced to engage in a mine countermeasures operation while under constant fire from coastal missile batteries. This is a slow, grueling process that could take months, during which the global economy would be in a freefall. This leads us to the fourth major damage: war expansion. A nuclear strike on Iran would force neighboring countries into an impossible position. Nations like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the UAE, who host U.S. bases, would suddenly become targets for Iranian retaliation. If Iran perceives that these bases were used to facilitate the strike, they would launch Shahab and Zulfiqar ballistic missiles at the oil refineries of Abqaiq and the skyscrapers of Dubai. The entire Persian Gulf, the world's gas station, would be engulfed in flames. The U.S. would then face a logistics collapse. To fight a war of this scale, the U.S. needs to move millions of tons of fuel, ammunition, and food across the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. If the regional bases are under constant missile bombardment and the seas are mined, the cost of war isn't just financial. It becomes a cost in time and lives. The U.S. would be forced to choose between abandoning its allies or launching a full-scale ground invasion of a radioactive Iran to silence the missile batteries. Now, let's consider the comparison of technologies. Many ask why the U.S. doesn't use conventional bunker busters instead. The GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, MOP, is a 30,000-pound bomb designed specifically for Iran's underground sites. It provides nearly the same tactical result as a small nuclear weapon without the radioactive fallout or the global political suicide. The reason the U.S. chooses conventional options is escalation management. In a conventional strike, you leave the enemy a way to survive and surrender. In a nuclear strike, you give them every reason to take the rest of the world down with them. From the inverse perspective, the Iranian leadership knows that their greatest strength is not their own nuclear potential, but their ability to make the world unlivable for everyone else. This is why they invest so heavily in cheap drones and expensive tunnels. They are betting that the U.S. is too rational to use a nuclear weapon because the U.S. has too much to lose. Iran has built a suicide vest around the global economy. If the U.S. pulls the trigger, the vest goes off. The fifth damage is domestic instability. Within 24 hours of a nuclear strike, the American public would see images of the destruction. Unlike the 1940s, we live in an era of instant information. The moral outcry, combined with the sudden economic crash and the fear of a retaliatory dirty bomb in a Western city, would lead to unprecedented civil unrest. The U.S. government would have to manage a domestic crisis while trying to fight a global war. The social fabric of the nation would be strained to the breaking point. As we move into the next phase of this analysis, we must ask, if the military and economic costs are so high, what are the secret diplomatic red lines that keep the nuclear silos closed? And what happens if a miscalculation forces the hand of a president? If the smoke begins to clear over the ruins of an Iranian facility, a new and darker cloud would immediately form over the halls of the United Nations and the world's financial capitals. This is the fourth major damage: total geopolitical isolation. Up until the moment of a nuclear strike, the United States maintains a network of alliances that form the backbone of its global power. But the use of a nuclear weapon, the first use since 1945, would shatter those bonds instantly. To understand why the U.S. is so hesitant, we must look at the reaction of the great powers, specifically Russia and China. For Moscow and Beijing, an American nuclear strike on Iran would be viewed as a definitive declaration that the international order is dead. It would be seen as the ultimate proof that the U.S. is a rogue superpower that will use any means to maintain its hegemony. The immediate reaction from Russia would likely be a full-scale military mobilization along its borders with NATO. Why? Because if the U.S. is willing to use nuclear weapons to solve a regional dispute in the Middle East, Russia must assume that it is only a matter of time before the same logic is applied to the conflict in Ukraine or the Baltics. The nuclear threshold is a psychological barrier. Once it is crossed, the Cold War logic of mutually assured destruction, MAD, becomes instantly assured destruction. Russia would likely provide Iran's remaining forces with high-end satellite intelligence, electronic warfare suites, and perhaps even its own tactical support to ensure the U.S. is bogged down in a meat grinder of a war. China's response would be even more devastating, though perhaps less kinetic. China is Iran's largest trading partner and a massive consumer of Persian Gulf oil. A nuclear strike that destabilizes the region is a direct attack on China's Belt and Road Initiative and its energy security. Beijing would likely lead a global movement to de-dollarize the world economy overnight. They would freeze American assets, halt the export of rare earth minerals essential for the U.S. military-industrial complex, and call for immediate international sanctions against Washington. The U.S. would find itself not leading a coalition of the willing, but standing alone against a united front of the global South. Then, we must look at the damage to alliances. Even traditional allies like the United Kingdom, France, and Germany would face immense internal pressure. Their populations, horrified by the humanitarian catastrophe and the sudden risk of a global nuclear war, would demand a total break from the United States. NATO could fracture in a matter of days. The U.S. would lose its forward operating bases in Europe and Asia, as host nations would fear being targeted by retaliatory strikes from Russia or China if they continued to house American troops. In this comparison of global influence, the U.S. currently enjoys soft power, the ability to lead through diplomacy, culture, and economic incentives. A nuclear strike exchanges all of that soft power for a temporary and likely ineffective hard power gain. It is a terrible trade. The U.S. would lose its seat at the head of the table and become a pariah state, much like the very regimes it seeks to contain. The inverse perspective here is that Iran actually counts on this. Their strategy is to make any American intervention so politically and diplomatically expensive that the U.S. never dares to take the final step. By embedding themselves into the economic and security interests of China and Russia, Iran has created a geopolitical shield. They know that an attack on them is an attack on the interests of the East. Furthermore, the spread of war would move into the cyber and space domains. Russia and China possess sophisticated cyber warfare capabilities that could paralyze American infrastructure, the power grid, water systems, and financial markets, without firing a single physical bullet. In the wake of a nuclear strike, these nations would have the moral high ground in the eyes of much of the world to launch these attacks as a defensive measure against an out-of-control superpower. The front line of the war would move from the Persian Gulf to the streets of New York, London, and Tokyo. The fourth damage, therefore, is the end of the American century. By using the bomb to shorten a war, the U.S. would effectively end its role as the leader of the world. The vacuum left behind would be filled by a chaotic, multipolar struggle where nuclear weapons become the standard tool of diplomacy. This is a world where no one is safe, and the cost is the very existence of a stable, predictable global civilization. As we look toward the final sections of our analysis, we have to ask, if the military, economic, and geopolitical costs are this high, what is the actual nuclear doctrine that governs these decisions? And is there any scenario where the U.S. would actually pull the trigger? If we look past the radioactive dust and the crashing stock markets, we find the most profound damage of all: the moral and legal collapse of the modern world. For over 80 years, the nuclear taboo has been the unspoken foundation of global civilization. It is the collective agreement that, despite our ideological differences, some weapons are too horrific to ever be used again. If the United States were to drop a nuclear bomb on Iran, it wouldn't just be destroying a target. It would be shredding the very fabric of international law that has prevented World War III since 1945. This leads us to our fifth major damage: the total erosion of American moral authority. To understand why the U.S. doesn't use these weapons to shorten a war, we must look at the just war theory and the Geneva Conventions. Modern warfare is built on the principle of distinction, the ability to separate combatants from civilians. A nuclear weapon, by its very nature, is indiscriminate. It kills the soldier in the bunker and the child in the schoolhouse with the same cold efficiency. If the U.S. crosses this line, it loses the right to ever condemn another nation for human rights abuses or war crimes. The rules-based international order, which Washington helped build, would effectively dissolve. Why should any nation follow the rules if the leader of the world breaks the biggest rule of all? This creates a comparison that the U.S. military leadership finds unacceptable. In a conventional war, even a brutal one, there is a path back to peace and a moral high ground to stand on. In a nuclear war, there is only the low ground of shared catastrophe. The cost of war here is measured in the soul of the nation. The domestic backlash within the United States would be unlike anything seen during the Vietnam War. Millions of Americans would likely take to the streets, not just out of fear for their safety, but out of a fundamental rejection of a government that uses the bomb as a first strike tool. The political divide in the country would turn into a chasm. The U.S. military, which prides itself on honor and precision, would face a crisis of conscience. How many pilots or silo officers would refuse the order? The risk of a domestic command and control collapse is a variable that planners must weigh heavily. From the inverse perspective, Iran's leadership understands this moral constraint perfectly. They operate in the gray zone, the space between peace and total war. They know that as long as they stay below the threshold that would trigger a nuclear response, they can continue to challenge American influence. They use the US's own morality and legal frameworks as a shield. By embedding their military assets in civilian areas and under cultural landmarks, they make the nuclear option even more unthinkable for a Western democracy. Furthermore, we must address the comparison of long-term health and environmental impacts. A conventional war ends when the guns fall silent. A nuclear war continues for generations. The damage 5 is the genetic debt. The fallout from a strike on Iran would not stay within its borders. Depending on the winds, it could poison the water and soil of America's allies in the region, such as Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq. The long-term cost of treating cancers, birth defects, and environmental degradation for millions of people across the Middle East would be a bill that the US would be forced to pay, or live with the eternal stigma of being the great destroyer. This is why the US chooses the long war over the nuclear shortcut. A long war is expensive, frustrating, and politically draining. But a nuclear strike is a final solution that leaves the victor as broken as the vanquished. The US military-industrial complex is designed for a permanent war of high-tech drones, intelligence gathering, and precision strikes. It is not designed to function in a world where the very air is toxic and the international community has turned its back on the dollar. The spread of war, in this moral context, means the death of diplomacy. Once you use a nuclear weapon, you can no longer talk to your enemies. You can only destroy them. This removes the safety valve of human communication. In the hours following a strike, every other nuclear-armed state, North Korea, Pakistan, India, Israel, would go to launch on warning status. The world would be one technical glitch or one panicked radar operator away from a total global exchange. As we prepare to conclude this analysis in our final segment, we must ask the ultimate question. If the bomb is never truly an option, how does the US actually plan to deal with a rising Iran? And what is the summary of this terrifying hypothetical that we must all understand to ensure it never becomes reality? As we reach the conclusion of this hypothetical journey, we must synthesize the brutal realities we've uncovered. The question was never just about whether the United States can drop a nuclear bomb on Iran. It has the physical capability to do so within minutes. The real question is why it chooses not to, even when faced with the frustration of a long, costly, conventional struggle. When we summarize the 5 layers of damage, prolonged existential war, the loss of the fleet, economic suicide, geopolitical isolation, and moral collapse, we see a pattern. A nuclear strike is not a shortcut to victory. It is a detonator for a global collapse. In the cold math of the Pentagon and the White House, the cost of a 20-year conventional war, as painful as it is, remains infinitely lower than the cost of a single day of nuclear conflict. The final comparison: conventional persistence versus nuclear instantaneity. To understand the US strategy, we must compare the two paths directly. In a conventional scenario, the US uses its massive advantage in intelligence, surveillance, and precision-guided munitions. This allows for escalation management. If the US destroys a drone factory, Iran might respond by harassing a tanker. This is a controlled tit-for-tat. It is expensive, it is slow, and it tests the patience of the public, but it keeps the world intact. In the nuclear scenario, there is no ladder of escalation. You start at the top. By skipping the intermediate steps, the US removes Iran's ability to back down. When you threaten an opponent with total extinction, you force them into a Samson option, pulling the pillars of the temple down on everyone. This is why the US would rather spend billions on Iron Dome systems for its allies or bunker buster bombs for its B-2 bombers than turn to the nuclear triad. The conventional path, for all its flaws, preserves the future. The nuclear path consumes it. The inverse perspective. Deterrence as a double-edged sword. We must also recognize that the existence of these weapons is what prevents their use. This is the great paradox of the nuclear age. The U.S. keeps its Minuteman III missiles and its Ohio-class submarines ready precisely so that Iran and its allies know that there is a red line that cannot be crossed. This strategic patience is what has kept the peace between major powers for decades. If the U.S. were to actually use the weapon, the deterrent is spent. The mystery is gone, and the horror becomes a reality that others will feel justified in replicating. Summary: the weight of the decision. So why not drop the bomb to end it early? Because the war wouldn't end. It would transform from a regional conflict into a global radioactive insurgency. Because the economy wouldn't survive. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the collapse of the US dollar would trigger a depression worse than 1929. Because the world would turn away. The US would lose its allies and its moral standing, handing the keys of global leadership to China and Russia. Because the fallout is more than just dust. It is the genetic and environmental debt that would haunt the Middle East and the world for centuries. The United States dares not drop a nuclear bomb on Iran because it is a rational actor that values its own survival. In the game of geopolitics, the ultimate power isn't the ability to destroy your enemy. It's the ability to achieve your goals without destroying the world you intend to lead. Conclusion: if a conflict between the US and Iran ever reaches a breaking point, it will likely be fought in the shadows, on the seas, and in the digital realm. The mushroom cloud remains a ghost of the past, kept in its cage by the terrifying realization that in a nuclear war, the winner is simply the one who dies last. So, after looking at the economic, military, and moral consequences, do you think the nuclear taboo will hold for another 80 years? Or will the pressure of regional conflicts eventually force a superpower to push the button?